My name is Jonathan LIBGOBER. I'm an assistant professor in the economics department. This session is meant to be somewhat informal, conversational, so I'll have a few questions that I've kind of thought about a little bit, but we'll.
If you didn't share with that.
But I didn't share with you.
That's okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Keep us on our toes. But yeah, so I thought we should. I was told, I guess, that we should talk about tenure, the tenure process, also about writing and research, and also just generally what are some hot topics in the data security, privacy, and competition space. So I guess to start us off, I thought it's something that maybe falls under all of those. All of you guys have written important papers. And so just if you're reflecting on some of the most innovative or important papers that you've worked on, do you think of those papers as having followed a trend? Was it kind of the hottest topic that was being worked on at the time, and you were just kind of doing the next natural project in that area? Or do you think of your more as having revealing that this was an important problem to work on, something that you had to convince others that it was worthwhile. So if you have any thoughts about, and feel free to specific papers that you worked on that you thought might have been kind of in just reflecting on the extent to which those were necessarily more following a trend or more setting a trend. I don't know who wants to go for it.
Next to you.
Sure.
I'll get started. So I think the honest answer is all of those paths are feasible to get some really cool papers, right? But I'll talk about one because later on, in response to what Danny asked me to do, to talk about antitrust and vertical integration merger issues, I have some thoughts on there, and particularly talking about Netflix. So I'm going to refer to a paper I wrote in around 2010. It was published in Marketing Science in 2012. And it was about bundling, which was a very old topic at that time, at least 50 years of literature. But I had a lot of interest in the economics of entertainment. And there it's very, very obvious if you go back and think about 2010, where most people consumed in-home video entertainment through cable TV bundles, right? And cable TV bundles are put together by a bundling firm that does not make the products that are being bundled. And the entire 50 years of literature on bundling was about a firm bundling its own products, right? Microsoft Office, the McDonald's, whatever, meal bundles, right? So I based on the work I've been doing on entertainment, I just thought this was so fascinating to study. And it turns out it fundamentally disrupts the economics of bundling. And so that was a very cool paper. It was really required thinking out of the box. And so that's something that just came to my mind, particularly because of the entertainment side.
Let me just engage on the hot topic and so and maybe it's idiosyncratic to me. I'm Liran, I'm an economist at Stanford. If we want to work on the hot topic, what we think is a hot topic, everybody else in the room think it's a hot topic. So it kind of doesn't make any sense to kind of target the hot topic. At least in economics, it's going to take you a year and a half to get data and 3 more years to get the code to converge and 5 more years to publish it. And by then, the hot topic of today is going to be very, very, very crowded and not that hot anymore. So I'm not sure, you want to think about, what's hot today. You want to think about, at least what I tell my students, I think I'm telling myself, is just look at the world and ask yourself what's exciting, what's interesting. And it's not that what you think is interesting and exciting, everybody else does, but as long as you think of yourself, and I think most of us don't think of ourselves as totally weirdos, if you think something is exciting and interesting, probably some other people will. And so just trying to kind of follow your own gut feeling of what you think is kind of new or exciting or unexplored, and just go for it. And it doesn't mean you get, perfect kind of success rate, but at least there was one reason that got you to explore something. Convince yourself it's a good reason. And once you are convinced, it's much easier to convince other people that that was a worth kind of exploration. successful or not. Sometimes the data, if it's empirical, the data is not cooperating, but at least, you know, the original motivation to go there was coming from you, and then it's much easier to convince, at least in our business, a lot of the job is to do something interesting and important, but also convince at least some people that is interesting and important, and it's much easier to do this convincing if you're believing in the product. So instead of asking what other people think is interesting, ask yourself what's interesting and just kind of go with your gut and hope for the best. So that's.
All right. Hey, I'm Dina MAYZLIN. I'm at USC Marshall in the marketing department. So yeah, I think that I'm with Liran in that, you know, I've been always moved by my curiosity. And what I think, you know, my advisor always used to say, like, look around you, look at something that doesn't make sense, you don't understand what's happening. Those are the ideas that are worth pursuing. You know, I tell my students, like, you're in the ideas business, you know, again, sort of what interests you, let your curiosity move you. So my dissertation was on word of mouth. And, you know, and it was back in, actually, Liran and I were in the same class together back in the day. We were at different schools, but we took an IO class together. We were students, and he was my TA, weirdly. It's a very small class. And so, yeah, so it was, you know, the 90s, the late 90s, and internet was becoming a thing. And I was interested in, you know, chat rooms. And I think, you know, it went well. My job market paper, you know, people liked it. There were definitely people who did not like it and who thought, you know, it was just sort of like trivial, right? Like just people chatting and, you know, I mean, it was a game theory model. It had all the hard stuff, but, you know, I think there was kind of the old guard that thought that, you know, internet maybe was going to go away, and, you know, people talking on the internet wasn't like a weighty, important topic like maybe other things. So in the beginning of my career, maybe it was a little harder. It wasn't super hard because a lot of people were interested, but there were definitely some people had to be convinced. I totally agree with Liran, and like, if you try to pursue a hot topic, by the time this thing comes out, you're already too late. It's like efficient market hypothesis or something. By the time something is hot, it's too late. You have to be there in the beginning. At the same time, I think it's a good idea to sort of like upgrade your skills always. So, you know, I have my first student with Hemant, who is, I remember at some point she decided she really needed to learn machine learning. I mean, it was before everybody was doing machine learning, and I think that really helped her. And so I think it's good to sort of, you know, always learn and always expose yourself to new methodologies, but, you know, in some sense to what's hot, you know, in the field, but not more in terms of methodology than in terms of topics, I think, because absolutely by the time something is a hot topic, it's a little late. You know, you have to be earlier than the hot, you know, you have to forecast the trend. But I don't think it's a good exercise anyways. I think young scholars should pursue things that interest them. And I think, you know, that's probably the optimal thing to do. Okay.
Yeah, so that's really great. So I guess continuing on, you know, this theme, for the papers or the projects that have been kind of very influential that you've had, do you think it was just luck that, you know, okay, you wrote something and then people liked it? Or was there kind of more like behind the scenes effort of like pushing students to work on something, kind of like, you know, how did you kind of convince, was it just writing the paper and that was it? Or was there other stuff that you felt was really important to kind of establish the agenda and to kind of get other people to be interested in it? I think we're often very used to having, you know, the idea, oh, well, the work should just speak for itself. But you know, sometimes it's sort of hard to necessarily see if that's the case. So I'll just.
All right, Liran. Okay. I mean, I think, yeah, for me, it's, you know, I sort of feel like I go on the road with the paper, right? So you usually get invited, you know, there's conferences, there's like the marketing science, maybe 6. There's also like the NBRs coming up. You know, you have all these different, like sometimes people invite you to give talks. And usually you present the same paper for, I don't know, half a year or even for the whole year. It's a little bit of like a road show, right? So you're telling them about this paper, this idea, you try to, get people to be interested in it. Beyond that, I'm not sure I've done anything. So yeah, you just, you try to, I do think it's generally a good idea to, what you guys are doing, to go to conferences and to talk to people and to get feedback, also. I think getting feedback is always a successful thing. I think there's a paper in marketing science that shows that like the more people you thank or something, it's predicts success. So I think just getting your work out there, it definitely helps. I think there's some folks who are just kind of more naturally comfortable, going to conferences, and some people who are less comfortable. So just getting outside your comfort zone and just making sure you make it to at least the big conferences to just, to interact.
Let me, I guess, few things. So on the luck part, I guess it's like any other business. When you're an entrepreneur or an athlete, luck is important in every aspect of this. Typically, it's not only luck. Typically, it's like you need to have some good hunch of what's exciting or what's interesting or what could work well, and then if you have some idea of what could work well, and then you get lucky to get the right data or something, to pursue it. But so for sure there's like a luck component here, but it's interactive. Is like you need to know where to be to take advantage of the lucky opportunities. But I think the best way to answer to some of your questions is maybe I'll give you some example from my own kind of specific papers. Like I was sitting in the IO classes as a graduate student, and one thing that struck me, I had a lot of friends. I'm Israeli. I had a lot of friends who are kind of in the business startup world. And when they think about the business, it's all about kind of product positioning and then what to innovate. And then you sit in IO classes and talk about competition policy. It's all about prices and quantity competition. Somehow we take the products as given. And I'm sitting there, that doesn't make sense. Like sort of price and quantities are kind of important, but for most businesses, this is not like the first order thing. So why are we so focused on that? But it was sitting in my head. I had nothing concrete to do with it. And then, a year later, I was reading a New York Times article about kind of competition among studios and kind of movie release dates. Basically, it's like you have multiple product, movies that are coming to theaters. I guess the pre-DVD, pre-Netflix, we are very old. And the article was all, it was like a whole kind of here, like the game theory, game of chicken, sort of Disney and Warner. They both want to get the movie kind of, to get out on Memorial Day because it's a hot kind of weekend kind of, for box office. And the first order announced they go on Memorial Day, and then kind of 2 months before one is going to go kind of switching the release date to 2 weeks later and stuff like that. So I'm reading this kind of long kind of Sunday kind of New York Times article, and so that was lucky because I'm not the regular reader of the New York Times, but it was stuck in my head that kind of, I do want to think about kind of the non-price competition aspect of kind of competition, and that seemed like prices are not an issue because all movies are more or less priced the same, so it seemed kind of clean. So it kind of got me thinking maybe it's a good opportunity to write kind of, a game theoretic model about competition in a non-price quantity space. I got a job at Stanford with the job market paper, so it was lucky, but sort of it came from kind of thinking that this might be a good opportunity. Another kind of example, then sort of they told me, okay, that's about movies. Who cares about movies? So I started working on healthcare and finance. But then sort of another example was like there was we had an undergrad student at Stanford. John Levin was his kind of main advisor, but I was kind of talking to him too. He was taking our classes, and then it turned out he presented his own thesis that was based on some data which seemed pretty unique from some sort of auto loan kind of company that was based in Phoenix, and the data seemed pretty exciting. It seems like they are targeting a population of very poor people that are buying cars, and the way they get the cars is because they basically lend them. They are kind of vertically integrating between the financing and the dealership, and the owner says this was kind of nice, but we were getting excited about the data, so it was similar in my mind. We thought there like an opportunity, And we felt like there's something very unique about this. So we made the decision, John and I, let's pursue it. And then we basically kind of talked to them, booked a flight to Phoenix to show that we are serious. And we came there for 3 days and sat with them with our data. And that started. We got out, four kind of well-published papers out of that. But it was the instinct to actually, because not every data opportunity you are going to take a flight to Phoenix and kind of and do this. So you kind of need to have some sort of luck to plan the opportunity, but then kind of to have some good hunch on kind of which opportunities to go after. And it's not that every time we had something like that was successful. We had a Netflix kind of project like 2 years ago, and we got data from Netflix, and then it fell apart. So it's not that you're hitting everything perfectly, but at least you need to know kind of, where to throw kind of your effort and time, and then try to kind of hope for the best, trying to kind of combine what people want to know, what you want to know, and what's out there.
All right, I'll try to give a very specific example about this because I've been engaged in it in the last 8 months and particularly right now. So about this time last year, I had spent about 6 months, working in various committees and panels talking about the use of AI for academic work, scholarly, writing articles and submitting them to our scholarly journals. And hopefully all the academics in this room will appreciate that. And what I found was most of the people who were controlling those policies were extremely conservative, and their approach was to restrict the use of AI, for instance, in writing research papers. And my point is it's inevitable. You cannot detect, you cannot monitor, you cannot do anything about it. So really restrictive policies don't make sense. But what really struck me was what journals were saying at the time. I looked at over 24 journals in medicine, computer science, business, across the board. Everyone said you cannot use AI for doing a review of an article, and for very good reasons. But the fundamental problem then is we have an increase in submissions to journals because authors are using AI and accelerating their work. And how are we going to maintain the critical metrics of a journal, which is how quickly you respond to the authors, and how good is your decision quality in terms of sorting acceptable papers from non-acceptable papers, right? So what I did last March was I brought 7 mostly assistant professors together. We hung out for 3 days, about 100 miles from here, and we watched the Indian Wells tennis tournament in the evenings. And in the daytime, we talked about this problem of how we must use AI in the academic review process. And over the next several months, we came out with a research paper, which big part of it was an operations model. And it's stunning, we talk about practice what you preach. So there are so many operations modelers in business schools. And I think we were the first ones to look at an academic journal as an operations process. It's an academic review process. It's simply a machine where submissions come in, and the output is you sort papers according to acceptable or not, and there is some error. And what does the use of AI and all of that do to that process? And then we look very carefully about how to infuse AI. Now, coming to your point about luck versus deliberation. So around June of last year, we had the core of it. Yeah. And I think I have presented this in at least 6 to 9 settings of particularly influential settings. I was at the Columbia AI conference last month and many others. And by December, we reached a point where there were 3 editors of our premier journals competing for that paper. And we now have it at a point where I hope it will become a trend-setting paper for a new type of paper for one of our top journals. And all of that is happening in these few weeks. So I think clearly, it's a hot topic, it's a current topic. It's not something we want to publish 3 years from now. We started this whole conversation in March. I'm hoping that the decision to publish will be happening in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So it really has to happen very fast. And that requires very careful steering. And that's what I've been doing over the last year.
Yeah, that's really great. So I guess, kind of maybe moving beyond, like, let's say the first paper, the first few papers that you might have. I mean, how would you advise juniors thinking about, like, when is it the right time, or how do you, or even, non-juniors, just how do you decide, like, which new strand of research you might want to go in? Is it just that you're doing movies and someone says you should do healthcare and then you do healthcare? Or is it, do you just get tired with something and then you do something and then you just say, I'm not interested in that anymore, I need to change? Or is it more kind of a continuous, organic transition between different topics, which you might characterize as just fundamentally like the same researcher might not be interested in these two different things. So I don't know if you have any.
No, I think, well, I think the general advice that I received and ignored, but should not have ignored, and I think it's the correct advice, is that when you come up for tenure, starting from the end, yeah, people count and people look at your publication, but also people want to kind of appreciate that you kind of change the way we think about something. Maybe more than one thing, but at least one thing. And typically a single paper is not going to do it. I mean, sort of, typically it's an agenda, or it doesn't do everything you do, but typically it's like, one page, you did one paper and that led to some question that had a follow-up paper, and I don't know, whether like 3 papers on a topic or 5 papers on a topic or like 20 years of research on a topic, that depends a little bit on the case. But you'd hope that sort of by the time you can't predict this stuff, but when you start a paper, you hope that at least some of the papers you're starting are going to lead to some follow-up questions or follow-up new data sets that you get access to, and they would build together like a coherent kind of, set of projects and papers that add up to kind of, to do more than the sum of the parts. So it's not, you cannot fully plan it. You cannot project it out 10 years and okay, I'm going to do this paper and then this paper. But you hope that some of this will come organically, and you want to think about it because if you just write one paper and then switch to and that's what I did when I started. I just I was doing a bunch of stuff and I had like tons of little papers and they were not totally correlated with each other. And I remember my department chair in my second year was telling me, you're working on too many things that are not connected to each other. And I'm like, screw you, let me do whatever I want. But in the end, actually, the reason I got tenured was because kind of eventually one of the topics I worked on, mostly selection markets, kind of emerged as something that led to a lot of follow-up. And sort of by year 6, I had enough papers on that topic that sort of connected to each other. And then probably that was the reason I got tenured. But again, it's hard to fully plan it because research is not totally deterministic, but you want to think about how these papers kind of are connected, because later when one case we had kind of at Stanford, we have really good CV, but each paper was a little bit distinct. And then when you kind of get, external letter writers to write letters, then they all love the papers, but each one likes a different paper, and each one doesn't really know the other papers because they're not directly connected. So it's hard to get the full excitement. So you want to have some sort of more coherence kind of to the thing, which is, again, partly luck, partly plan, and partly kind of, you need to think about it when you decide which next project to pursue and which project to kind of maybe not pursue or postpone for later or stuff like that.
Yeah, I think, I basically am agreeing with what everyone's saying. I mean, I think programmatic research is always a good idea. It makes it easier for tenure, makes it easier for letter writers, makes it easier for the promotions and tenure committee. I do think that there's sort of like different types of researchers, and there are many ways to skin a cat. There are many ways to get tenure. I think that there is something to be said for people who sort of, study at least a couple of topics, not have and then, Liran had that too. Because I think, researchers tend to, I think if usually a few papers come out of a dissertation, and usually there's some kind of unifying themes. And I think we want to encourage our young scholars to pursue those themes deeper and, to sort of look at different angles. And if people are pursuing very interesting themes, then, there's a lot of work to be done in those themes. So I think it sort of makes sense why academia values, this sort of correlation or programmatic research. I was never good at strategic kind of career making. I followed my curiosity. I think most people tend to follow their curiosity. I think sometimes what happens to young scholars is they they get very excited and then they join a bunch of, they have a lot of co-authors and the co-authors are working all in different things and they join a bunch of different projects and there's no real theme. I think you want to avoid that a little bit, right? So just like, don't do it to the extreme. But I think it's also fine to have, 3 different topics or 1 major topic, a minor topic and some other things that don't really fit. I don't think there's really punishment for that. But yeah, as much as you can, think about ideas deeply and think about, there is some reward for, if you on the margin, if you're choosing between different projects, if one of them relates to your previous work, maybe it makes sense to do that early on. As you get older, then, things change. Sometimes you get really sick of things you were doing, you want to do something different. All right.
Yeah, one thing I would do is emphasize what both of you said earlier, which is that, I think good research really is driven out of curiosity and passion because, the average a paper takes about 2 years to publish, 2 years of hard work. And if you're not excited about it, it's like it's boring, right? Whereas if you wake up in the morning thinking about that problem and you go to bed thinking about it, and then that makes it really exciting. But the other part, at least for those of us at business schools, one of the things I got very early on is that, yeah, we want to do rigorous research, but it somehow needs to be grounded in reality, right? So I think I would encourage scholars to go out, reach out to companies, talk to people in an industry, even go to industry conferences, and you hear something totally different, but it gives you a truckload of ideas. And for me, I work in technology, and for me, just waking up and being somewhere produces research ideas because there's so much happening in our world, right? For instance, right now I've been doing some work on AI legislation, and you might know in the US at the federal level, we have about nothing, but we have over 1,500 bills on AI across the 50 states. And that opens up so many interesting questions about what is being done, and I can list many of them. Right. So I think passion is really critical. You should be interested about that topic. Otherwise, it's just not fun. Right. But secondly, try to connect it to reality. And one of the other things I do, you talk about Hemant learning, machine learning. I think every 10 years or so, I think of infrastructure. Like infrastructure takes a long time to build. And I find 6 months where I say, I'm just not going to do any real work, like produce anything. I'm just going to learn something new. And that pays off over the next 10 years because you learn how to look at problems very differently or get into a new domain like healthcare. Because there's incredible amounts of things you have to absorb about that new domain before you can produce useful things. So I think I would say every 8 to 10 years, take out time and invest in infrastructure.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So the next question, I don't know, might be divisive. I hope I don't know. But I want to talk a little bit about the, let's say, frontier between general interest work versus field specific works. And specifically, what I'm interested in is whether you think there is a trade-off between the two. Is it if I'm targeting kind of one audience more, that might kind of turn off people in other audience, even though it's very important for that audience. But maybe there isn't a trade-off. Maybe if you're doing it well, there isn't, it's actually all just the same. So I guess my question is, do you think there's a trade-off? How would you describe the trade-off? And how would you kind of advise juniors how to navigate that trade-off? Should they kind of think very carefully about how they would describe their experiment to a macroeconomist, or how should juniors kind of approach this difference? And I say it might be divisive because I know in econ there's a very high premium on general interest, and I'm not so in other fields it might be different, but I'm just kind of curious how you might think of that trade-off.
So maybe I'll start, and I don't know if I'll address the question from my research directly, but as an editor, I see a lot of papers. For instance, let's say there are scholars in information technology studying about the impact of the internet on education and relationships to poverty and other aspects, right? So what does that do? That's apparently would fall in your narrow aspect, and I see young scholars doing that, and so very few people would be interested in it. But I think our review community tends not to take a harmful view of that. What they look for is or respect is good research, right? Now, of course, if you take a giant hammer and you're solving a tiny nail, it will be less appreciated. It may show up when people write your tenure letters. So I think having that balance is important between impact and then doing some things very carefully. So it's if you're going to do all your 6 papers on this narrow problem, you may not get exciting letters or other ways of demonstrating impact 5 to 10 years down the road.
Yeah, so when I guess partly when you say general interest, at least in economics, I mean you can talk about general interest journals, but there are many field papers that make it to general interest journal, even if they mostly cater to the field. They're just the field thinks of them as important enough to make it to the area or to economic. So the distinction is so I guess the one thing I would say about you want to have a core constituency, you want to have a field. You cannot have 5 papers. One is in labor economics, one is in public economics, one is in industrial organization, and in the end, you need to be part of a club, part of a group. Think of a letter writer, think of your referees. You don't want to kind of confuse people of what you are. Same like in the junior job market, same like when you come up for tenure. That said, I mean that doesn't mean you should not be reaching out to kind of across fields. And then try to kind of, explain your work. You can sometimes do it by going to their conferences. Like if I'm an IO guy working on financial market, maybe I should go to finance and then kind of present in finance things and try to explain it. Sometimes the language is a bit different or the methods are a bit different, so it requires more work. But I think people appreciate when you branch out of your core kind of constituency and go to other fields. Sometimes you do it through co-authors. One of my most successful collaboration is with Amy Finkelstein. I came in as an RFP student in IO. She came in as a Jim Poterba student in public economics, and we started working together, starting with different methods, but we kind of educated each other about it. And then it was much easier for me or for our paper to branch out to the public sphere because she was talking to her guys, and so the her guys understood what she was saying, and she told them the right thing because I explained to her how to do the IO ideas kind of to the public guys and vice versa. She explained to me how to think about the public ideas kind of and translate them to IO. So sometimes you can branch out through co-authorship and collaboration, but you don't want to kind of just go all over the places. There's some, again, related to the theme. You want to have some sort of a set of letter writers that view you as the IO guy or the antitrust guy or something. You cannot just be all over the, especially until after you get tenure, you can do whatever you.
So we don't quite have the same level of division of marketing. We do have, I guess, like subfields. We have consumer behavior, quantitative. Within quantitative, we have like reduced form people, maybe more structural people. So there's some of that. I mean, I think it's true if you want to have a lot of citations, you can be speaking to just the structural people or something like that, right? So if you want to have a large number of citations, you have to, your work has to be rigorous, but you have to be able to communicate it well. And, it has to appeal, at least the topics and the results have to appeal to, different audiences. So I think that's how sometimes you get scholars who are just excellent scholars and like are pushing the technical boundaries in their fields, but they have like very few citations. And I think it's okay. They still get tenure, but, and they say, oh, we're just too smart for, this is like the peasants don't need to cite us. I mean, I guess I'm more on the my work generally has appealed to a bunch of different audiences for different reasons. I'm happy to, talk to consumer behavior folks, who have a totally different background from me. I'm sort of more on the, let's address managerial problems that, when things become, I think, a little too technical, it's hard to appeal. But I think there's definitely, if you love kind of more technical things and you just, there's 10 people in the field who will read your work and 5 people
and your mother.
and your mother, You could also be very successful, you know, it doesn't mean you won't be successful, but you probably won't have the impact that, you know, that potentially you could have.
Just before it was one thing that came up before, and let me just emphasize it at least, is that you need to have fun. So all this thinking about fields and general interest, and like, you just need to have fun doing what you do. And the one way I think about it for myself is, the reason I'm in academia is I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. I don't want to have a boss. and I think it's true for most of us. And once you start thinking too much about these strategic and career incentives, then you have this anonymous boss kind of driving. And the whole point of doing what you're doing is that you don't let other people, anonymous or not, kind of telling you what to do. So just don't forget to think about, let's have fun, let's work on stuff we care about and are curious about. And yeah, you know, in the background you want to kind of, yes, as Dina said before, like on the margins are like 2 projects that are equally exciting for you, one more connected to stuff you did, one less, one caters to more your constituency, one less. Then maybe you want to make this as a tiebreaker, but let's not make this kind of the thing we are obsessed about, because it takes all the fun out.
Yeah, that's always a good thing to keep in mind. I don't know how much fun I've had with you know, getting rejected and but that's kind of part of the process. That's, I'm sure, yeah. I don't think it's but kind of continuing on the fun theme. You know, I want to talk a little bit about what makes a paper well written, right? Like what do you when you think of a well-written paper, like what does that kind of mean to you? Is it like some kind of poetic kind of the sentences all have to rhyme in the right way, or and in particular, I mean, given that we're talking about fun, how do you have fun writing papers? Because you know, working on the writing specifically, because I find myself often kind of obsessing over these like very small details, because I don't want the referee to kind of pick up, you know, the wrong message, or a reader just generally. I don't maybe want to make this too much about the publication process per se, but yeah. So yeah, I guess the question, just what makes a paper well written in your mind, and how do you kind of have fun bringing a paper to that point, given kind of all the other demands that you know, publication and writing has?
So I thought about this, like not directly, but over many years. And one of the first papers I wrote, or really my PhD advisor wrote, and it was about, at that time, this was like 40 years ago, about databases and synonym problems, homonym synonym problems in database across organizations. And Steve ended up writing this paper. I was the co-author. You say tomato, I say tomato. And Batman and Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent and Superman, that was in the first paragraph of the paper, right? So I think we sometimes end up writing very boring papers, but even like I would read them to fall asleep. So I think it would be awesome if we can do that more often. I have never had a paper like that after that, but I think I have had interesting section headers and other things in papers, because that's how you're trying to get the reader excited about them, right? The second thing I found very useful, you know, is I think most people think of in terms of sequence, a written paper comes first and presentation comes next. We often write our papers and derive the presentations. I think it needs to be turned around. Because a presentation is about persuasion and storytelling and really looking at the listener in the eye and trying to explain something to them. And we lose that when we write a paper. And I find myself actually doing it in that sequence. I develop a presentation and then use that to write my paper. And I found that to be a much more effective, you know, better written paper. All the other things, of course, have to be there, you know, proper writing, math, whatever else you were doing. And I mean, all that is a given. But I think at the end of the day, we're doing storytelling. Now, and the third thing I want to mention, especially as somebody who writes theory papers, that, you know, when you read or watch a movie or read a book or a novel, there's some suspense that's left over. And unfortunately, we destroy all the suspense in our abstract and introduction. So like, you know, after you've read the first 2 pages, there's nothing more to learn from the paper. And sometimes I wish we could write papers in a way that you really get that light bulb shine towards, you've got to read the whole paper to get there. But yeah.
So, okay, so we might be not perfectly correlated on this. So let me agree. I always start writing with the slide deck. I mean, even if I don't plan to present it, it's much easier to do the PowerPoint version when you sort of have it's kind of the outline. And in the vast majority of papers, kind of the order of the presentation is the same as in the paper. I mean, often in many empirical papers, you're like, should I present the data first and then the model? Should I do the model first and then the data? And whatever you end up deciding that you're most comfortable in the presentation ends up typically the right answer for the paper. So, and then once you have a slide deck that you're kind of okay with, then actually it's much easier writing process because you're just now writing up the slides. So it's a much more kind of, linear process instead of, you need to become like an author and then start innovating how to kind of build the suspense or not. On the suspense part, at least in the scientific writing, no suspense, no mystery. Like, if you find something, I'm not sure it makes it more fun, but you see it often in empirical papers. If you don't tell me what your results, I start worrying about whatever you might be getting, or your identification, your instrument, things like that. But that once I know the results, then half of my concerns might be irrelevant because they're going in the other direction of the thing I worry about. So just getting the punchline up front kind of targets the concerns in particular direction. So I think you do want to kind of give everything in very, very early and then just kind of, address these other than build the suspense. Not that it makes it a nice movie to watch because then people stop reading after the intro, but at least kind of you avoid the randomness in the comments, in the feedback and stuff like that. The third thing I'd say is that you want to have, and something, as an editor, I was an editor for many years. I think you want the intro to declare a clear objective, and often you don't think about it because many projects, at least for me, and I think it's true for many empirical projects, the data seemed exciting. You worked with the data, you did some stuff with it, you found some cool results, you wrote a model, you estimated it, and then like, okay, how should I write the intro to kind of put some packaging? Which is just the natural in many, many, many cases. So people first do all the work and then okay, how do I kind of package it? It's like, I came up with this amazing blender and now I need to kind of design the box. The problem is with this is that sometimes the packaging is kind of not that exciting. So you want to think about writing the intro as being very clear about what's the object of interest that you're trying to get at. And you need to thread the line very, you don't want to make it so interesting that you never deliver. And you don't want to make it so narrow that you perfectly deliver, but nobody cares. So you need to sort of find the right place to kind of, okay, this is the object I'm interested in. This is why I want to know this object. And then hopefully kind of the rest of the paper delivers on this object. But what you see in many papers that some of them I ended up accepting after revisions, but the first version of the paper was like, this is all amazing. The model is amazing. The data is amazing. But what's the value proposition? So you want a little bit of the value proposition of the paper, and then you want to use the intro to kind of to claim this or something like that. So something to think about, something you want to think about before you even start. But often you ended up doing the paper you wanted to do anyway. But even then, you have some kind of flexibility on how to think about what it is, the question to which this is the answer, and you want to think about it hard because it's not always trivial. Sometimes it's obvious, but in many cases you need to kind of do some thinking.
Yeah, so I think my thing used to be when I was, so I was at Yale before I was at USC, was to always push the grad students to have a research question. Especially when it came to structural work, sometimes there was literally no research question. It was just again, I was at Yale when structural models were king and everybody was doing structural models. And so it became such a refrain that when one of the Yale grads was giving a talk, I was already here. He gave a talk. It was a pretty good talk, actually. He got a good job, not at USC, somewhere really good. I met with him. He said, I know what you're going to say. There was no research question. So I think so kind of, echoing Liran, having a research question, having an exciting introduction. for theory papers, having some real examples. The equivalent of that in theory, I guess, is just kind of a model that's not really about anything. And there's some kind of, awkward, fitting into some kind of example. So, I think if you have work that's interesting and exciting, that's asking a research question, that, sometimes you get access to the data before you would get a chance to pose the question, I think that makes it harder. I think if you first have the question and then you collect the data, it makes it easier. So I think some research kind of lends itself better to that. In terms of writing, so I did a new thing, which is I'm writing a paper with a grad student, and he's great. But like once in a while, so we're like, if we're gonna send it to a journal, once in a while a sentence just sounds awkward to me, just a little bit awkward. He did a lot of the writing, and so I've started putting it into ChatGPT and saying, this is marketing science paper, can you edit it for clarity? And it's usually just like a very small change, and sometimes I don't like the change. It makes it less clear. It's not like, but I would say, I don't know, 60% of the time, it's actually a pretty good change. And they're very, very small changes. And so I started to do that. I started to use, I used to use copy editors. And now I started like very, very carefully, with very precise prompts. And again, with a lot of oversight, and I literally do it sentence by sentence. I don't put in a paragraph. I'll just put a sentence that sounds like a little bit off, like a little unclear. And hopefully, I think it's making it better. I think it's sort of like, it's maybe not as good as a human copy editor, but maybe is, some kind of a marginal benefit. And so, yeah, I'm actually very interested in how, and I think here the young people have an advantage over, more experienced, more older people, just how people are using, generative AI to help them write research. Because I think, the editing, but also I think people are using it to solve models and are using it to quickly solve different types of models and to see what assumptions you need, or just use it in these like very, very novel ways that I think, can be good, can be interesting. And so, yeah, I would love to, if you guys want to talk about that, I'd love to hear more about how you're using it.
So I didn't realize that sitting in the middle gives me the advantage of stealing the mic every time. But two more things on writing. One, especially for empirical papers, there's like huge importance for the exhibits, like typically figures and tables, because so many people, before they even start reading a paper, they just go, if it's in the end or in the middle, or kind of they go through the exhibits and try to get a sense of what the paper is about without having to read anything. So one, it's good to have like 6 exhibits or 10 exhibits and not 25, because if it's 25, you probably don't know what the paper is about. But also make sure, and which is not always easy, but not always possible even, but when you can, make sure that the exhibits are standalone, because these guys that are flipping through the exhibits, you want them to get as much as they can out of the exhibit without needing to read the text that is associated with them. So that's one advice. The other advice, or this my view of readers, so people read linearly. So the way I think about readers, they start at the abstract, then they sometimes get to the intro, then they sometimes continue, but nobody skips. Once they drop, they drop. I mean, so you lose them. So make sure that the intro is easy to read and get you kind of most of the paper, because some people will stop after the intro. But if you have like a big model section with like gazillion equations that are really hard to get in, think about moving stuff to an appendix, because if it's section 2 and people drop it because there's like too many kind of Greek letters over there, then they never get to the data section. So just think of like people as like very linearly, and some process of getting 2 people to drop, and you want to just minimize the amount of dropping. So if these are like complicated stuff that sort of can get deferred to later, defer them to later. If they're complicated stuff that can go to an appendix, they're not essential for every reader, put them to an appendix. If you have complicated stuff in a robustness section in section 6, just before the conclusion, it's not the end of the world, because if people drop there, like, they still got all the paper in anyway. So think about this kind of, that's at least the way I think about kind of the way people read papers, and so try to make it easy early and more difficult later to the extent you can.
Okay, well, this has been really really awesome. I think we have maybe 6-ish minutes left, so I thought for the maybe last question, we'll see. I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically on the topic of, data security, privacy, and competition. We've talked a little bit about, stuff we worked on, but I'm curious what you think the most important open questions are in this area. My undergraduate was in math. Math has many super well-defined, Hilbert's problems, or these questions that you can just provide an answer or not. And one of the difficult things in social sciences is that the open questions are not like yes, no, or they're much more kind of and that makes it both harder to kind of definitively answer them, but also harder to kind of identify what is the open question, what is the thing that's not understood, because no one really writes down something very specific that you can do. And often, the open questions you are left with in the conclusions of papers are just completely unachievable and unattainable. So I'm kind of wondering if you guys on this specific topic, if there's anything that you have in mind about what's a good open question, open topic, what would you think is an interesting area for work?
Sure, I'll start. So I don't actually do work in this area, but I'll tell you, but I do have an opinion. Never stop, not doing anything, never stop me from having an opinion. So I actually think that some of the work that I personally found interesting was work that related to privacy, data privacy, but just privacy in general, was behavioral work. So some of my colleagues do work on that. Kristen Deal, Monsi, who I think is not here, is a grad student who's doing her thesis on that. And I just feel like, Alessandra Christie has some work on that, but, I really think sometimes, sort of there's, like in my area too, which is, more word of mouth interactions, there was sort of the quant work came a little bit before, but then there were all these open, basic kind of consumer psychology questions. And then now there's like a very rich literature in behavioral research and psychology and consumer psychology that deals with that. And I think that's true for privacy, because it really is, a lot of it is perceptions, right? So if you think about what people say about privacy versus, what they actually do, these are very, very different things. And so that's been one of the things that's, like the mystery of privacy, that people act in ways that seem inconsistent with what they say they care about. And I think with AI, and the rise of AI, that's also, some really interesting things about that. I'm interested in kind of the border between what, interactions, social media and privacy, and just, security. And so I think there's some interesting questions about that. So how do people feel about, whatever they generate being fed into an LLM, and ChatGPT, spitting it out? Does it increase or decrease my desire to post online? So that's some of the work I'm doing with my co-authors. But I'm gonna hand it to Liran.
Yeah, I want privacy and data security. I'm not sure. I haven't done much work on this.
But you have an opinion.
But it's more an opinion what's right and what. I'm not sure in terms of open question. I think the economics of privacy is the high level economics of privacy. We understand. I was in just before COVID, like 2019. I was in a conference of reinsurance in Zurich, where all the Europeans were all about. It was just after GDPR, and then people know like and from an insurance market perspective, this is awful, because sort of now you cannot price on all the stuff that you kind of need to price to get market efficiency getting better. And the Europeans were all like, yeah, but privacy, that's kind of that's a value that is above all this other stuff. And I didn't relate to it at all, but but that's not economic. That's just that's values, which is fine to kind of disagree. But I think we all understand how kind of having more versus less information affect markets. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be studying it, because it has different implications, quantitative effect in different places. But I'm not sure we have like some big open-ended question about how privacy is affecting stuff. In antitrust, I think the two things to come up as a topic, again, I wouldn't say it's a question, but it's a topic, is one is, it came up like some version of AI and automated pricing and how they interact with each other, how they interact with customers, to what extent kind of the old models still work when sort of, prices kind of, are kind of updated in real time. And the other one about antitrust is like when Dina and I were sitting in this kind of IO class in the late 90s, then when they taught you about antitrust, it was basically horizontal mergers of this and vertical mergers of this, and that's it. And now you look at all kind of the type of kind of acquisitions kind of that are going on, they're all in between. They're like self-preferences in platform. When you think about, Netflix buying sort of Warner, like, is that vertical? Is that horizontal? Is something in between? So the set of objects that we care about are now spanning a much richer set of cases. And it makes you want to kind of, I don't know, if either to have like one big kind of framework to think about them or just have a lot of case studies that later kind of will add up to something more.
So yeah, I wish we talked about hot topics for 20 minutes rather than 20 seconds left, but because I actually put together a bunch of slides because Danny and I talked about vertical mergers, and it's stunningly not as simple as everybody makes it out to be. The dimensions at which you need to look at these multiple layers and, both vertically and horizontally. The Netflix Warner case illustrates that so beautifully. And this is actually a very interesting industry when you're looking at, firms working across layers. If you're looking, let's say, automobiles, right? Every car manufacturer will maybe pick a tire manufacturer to partner with. They might pick 2 or 3 for different models, but you're not going to mix tires in a car from different companies. But when you look at a bundler, a distributor of content, they will want the Warner content, they want the Disney content. So they're not substitutes. Consumers care about variety. The whole discussion of vertical mergers, I think, changes. That's one. Then you have network effects. You have different types of markets, right? Are you getting walled gardens? Are you getting, everybody working with everybody else? Are you getting a setting where there's a dominant manufacturer or a dominant retailer? There's so much richness in just this one topic of vertical merger. I wish we had time. I actually have a lot of slides. I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested.
Yeah, well, we have something to talk about for the rest of the conference. I want to thank everyone.
But before we do, let me just say, as is often the case, like with class, sometimes we go over. So I want to say we're at time. If you need to leave, feel free. We have our discussants here who can take questions. Also, for those who are going to be faculty for tomorrow, we have a 6 p.m. dinner. I'll depart from here a little bit early because for those of you who are not normally on the USC campus, I'll take you for a very quick tour as the sun sets, and it will be beautiful. We'll go by Steven Spielberg's building. I'm really not making this up. Steven Spielberg's building, George Lucas's building. We take some photos together. It'll be lovely. Are you all okay taking some questions? Great. So we're going to have questions. And just to sort of get people started, actually, John, you raised a point here when discussing the, you're like, well, but you haven't faced rejection. And
I didn't say that.
there was talked about the feeling of rejection. So actually, I want to give it an example because we all learn by analogy. So in 1978, Marvin Gaye released the album "Hear My Dear." It was a brilliant album, but Liran, actually, something that you said, sometimes the timing just isn't right. So in this particular time, people were shifting to disco, very bad idea, but and it was a terrible time for him. He also had tax problems. He started a drug addiction, cocaine. By the way, don't do cocaine. And it was a very, very difficult time. And we've all had these experiences where we have felt rejection, even though we know that the paper was great, even though we know we have talent. And so I wanted to get everyone's sense of this because, by the way, there's a happy story until Marvin Gaye is literally murdered by his father a few years later. But before that happens, he wins his first set of Grammys for an album that included probably one of the greatest songs of the last 50 years, "Sexual Healing." Some of you have heard that. Yeah, yes? Okay, right? The rest of you are like, Marvin Gaye, who's Marvin Gaye? The point is, we can rebound from these really terrible moments. How did each of you, at some point, there was a paper that you knew was great, and yet somehow
Only one?
every paper was great, but not everyone sees the greatness in the paper the way that you do. How do you get over that hurt, that frustration, that anger, to move on and to just do your own thing in a way that gets you the equivalent of the Grammy?
It's a lot of
That last part.
pressure.
Yeah.
There should be a happy ending.
Yeah.
Again, mostly happy until.
All right, so yeah, there are incredibly lovely papers that don't get accepted at the journals, but the way I think about it, then if that topic really matters to you, and ultimately, and especially you reach a point where yet another paper in the top journal doesn't matter, which is only going to be read by 7 people or 12 people anyway, then go do other stuff with it, go present it, talk to people in government or industry, wherever that paper has impact, go share the impact. It doesn't matter that it didn't show up in the journal that you were targeting to. And maybe if you want to ensure that it's published somewhere so you can make your conversations more meaningful, then find an appropriate place to publish. So I think that may be one way of dealing with that rejection, because yeah, it's important, you want it out, but really being out in a journal is really too meaningless. At some point, you could achieve a lot more impact in other ways.
Yeah, the two is not very deep, but it's psychology, and I guess it helps kind of, maybe early on it always like, early on it took a week to kind of recover from a rejection, now it takes me 2 hours, but not because kind of it's better, just because I've seen enough of this and I know that after every rejection, after 5 rejections, the 6th gets accepted or something. But the two things, it's part of it, it's a bit like, a basketball player that is shooting and missing. I mean, you just forget about the last shot and shoot the next one. I mean, like, which is either like resubmitting the same paper to a different journal or giving up on this paper, getting it in a lower journal and then moving up to the next. But just belaboring kind of, the old stuff, what can you do? I mean, sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's the referee is an idiot, and you just, you never know, but it's never you. So you just move on. I mean, what can you, I mean, that's the only way to stay healthy in this profession, because at least in economics, I think the law school people are laser. In economics, every talk you give, they tell you how dumb you are. Everything that's wrong, you've worked on something for 3 years, and all they get at you is like, what's wrong with everything you've done? So if you are sensitive to this, then you're in the wrong profession. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, like, you just need to kind of be confident and then have a thick skin to not let it get to you. Otherwise, you're just going to suffer your entire career.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think I remember when I was, so I was trying, I have 2 kids at one point in my career, pretty early on, I was trying to get pregnant. So it was like, and then at the same time I received I don't even think it was a rejection. I think it was just a very harsh review, and it was very upsetting and felt very personal, and I was, not very experienced. And I remember going to the drugstore to buy a pregnancy test to cheer myself up to see if I was pregnant. But I was crying, I was crying because I just got, and so they just assumed, that was my pregnant. I was crying because I was like, and she's like, whatever you want, honey, whatever you want. And then I went to, at Yale, there's this coffee shop, and I went downstairs to the basement and I took the test and I was pregnant. And now, this pregnancy is 21 years old and his name is Ezra. But I think, for me, it always helped, to have to sort of think about the wider life, right? So you have your job, you have your papers, and of course it feels very personal, but also, you have your friends, you have your family, I had kids pretty early on, and it wasn't easy, especially as a mom, but, we're all adults, right? We have rejected papers. Our papers will have been rejected. It's just, try to take the feedback the best you can. Often, I hate to admit it, the reviewers, had some really valid points, even, and sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it wasn't fair. But, try to just be cope with it, try to make, comfort yourself. Doesn't have to be a pregnancy test, but whatever makes you happy.
I'll steal it again. The one thing I would say is that, sorry, I think people also feel, I mean, there's a lot of noise in the process. I've been editor 11 years, I see it on both sides. There's noise in the process. It's not like bad noise, it's not discrimination for the most part. It's just noise. I mean, it's like it's hard to know even not to know what the ground truth is, but like random stuff about referee waking up the wrong way, who knows? But just one thing to remind everybody, at least I always try to remind it to myself, is that for every negative epsilon, there's a positive epsilon. So like a paper that shouldn't have gotten in and got lucky. But we never we always, it's like going back to basketball, like you remember the shots you didn't make, you don't remember the shots you made. So it's the same thing. I mean, we tend to remember the referees that kind of, didn't take the paper that we loved. We never remember the referees that took the paper that we didn't love so much. So remember, it's kind of symmetric in the end of the day.
All right, so before you stole the mic, I was going to say about Dina's thing. It's always wonderful when people give you advice that anybody can emulate.
Just get pregnant.
And yeah, just going back to the question from the previous panel about getting engagement and participation from students and prodding them. I go into class with a cattle rod and I tell students either you engage yourself or I will use the cattle rod. Danny might want to do now.
Oh my gosh.
Do we have any questions from somebody else? Yes, we've got one.
So the panel agreed on making the presentation first and then writing the paper later. But I think most of us here are hardwired doing the traditional way of writing the paper and then making the presentation. So let's say we want to follow your route of making the presentation. We'll still think like, okay, here's the introduction, here's the literature review, here's the data. How do you break that thought process and like go by what you see?
Yeah, so let me just clarify. And because you brought up something about outlining, which is a very good way to write a paper. And I did not mean that. I actually meant when you give a presentation, I found myself, at least after many years, using examples and other things that were not in the paper. Because when you're communicating to an audience, you feel you can do it differently. And I found eventually that maybe that was the way it needs to be in the paper. Don't sacrifice meaningful, interesting aspects of the conversation for a very traditional, boring, writing style. That's what I meant by doing, using the presentation as an exemplar for the written work.
Yeah.
That's something.
I mean, I often end up presenting things that are just kind of not really polished, like at a conference first. And so naturally is the case that the paper is not written. It's just like a very early version of the paper. What field are you in?
Economics.
Economics. I'll let really relax.
So, no, I don't think I have something new to say. I mean, it's more like the presentation it's faster to put a slide deck than to write a paper. And some version of the slide deck is going to be the outline of the paper that you're going to write anyway. So it seems like a natural step kind of before you go write it. I mean, even if you write a paper without presentation, you need to outline it, like what the order of sections and what the order of paragraphs or something like that. So I guess a slide deck is similar. It's not exactly the same. Maybe there are like pictures or videos you want to show in the talk that you don't want to put in a paper. But in terms of the order of presentation, the order of kind of arguments, what comes first, what comes next. I mean, that seems to me like the same, and it's just a natural way to kind of, at least for me, again, it doesn't mean it should work for everybody, but that for me.
Okay, I think there's time for one more question if anyone has.
The quick question. So this is a question more from the law perspective. So I'm wondering so I think one thing that's challenging about writing in this area as a law professor is that there are so many economists who are also writing on many of these topics. So I'm wondering if there's like a division of labor, what are the things that are more challenging for you to write about that create opportunities for the law professors to write on that are still sort of like economically interesting, statistically interesting? So are there examples from projects where you sort of have gone into something and you feel like I don't feel confident writing on this?
I'm going to let that mic go.
Not sure. I think sometimes I think about the cross-discipline stuff is like we are all doing the same thing. We just use different languages. So it's not really different questions often. It's just, we have a different way to communicate the same ideas to our guys, and you have different ways to communicate the same idea. And it's nice to have conferences like this where you try to actually kind of realize that this is the same idea. But I don't know that like we should do divide and conquer thing. Like so I think if it's interesting, then all of us should be working on it. And then just make sure that the message got across. I mean,
Yeah, so maybe I work a little bit less in kind of a legal, area that overlaps with, legal scholarship. I mean, I think I have read some legal papers, sometimes for consulting work. Yeah, it's a very different, approach. I think for me, the legal scholarship that's, it's some of it is less accessible than others to me, right? So because again, but I feel like there are some papers that are much more accessible. So I would say if you want to have impact, for example, on marketing scholars or economists, it's more, I don't think you have to use the same terminology or sort of divide and conquer, but more communicate in ways that, maybe uses less of the terminology that, like when I consult, once in a while people will just use a term that everybody knows but me. And then somebody has to like lean over and say, oh, this means blah, 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 so but I think that's just a cross field kind of communication. I would love to see, I think there's less communication between marketing scholars and legal scholars. I mean, I think Danny is sort of the bridge, because he's in both. But yeah, these kinds of conferences where, I have not been to the law school before Danny came, and now I've been I know this lounge really well. So I think it's just, we probably need more conversations across different fields.
Okay, so I think that's it. We should thank the panelists for their time, and I'm not sure what's next, but dinner.
Danny,
Danny,
The tour is going to give a tour
yeah,
to some folks.
but yeah.
And so, we need the next steps, Danny.
Okay, you just say thank you to everybody for coming, and then we'll